Hi, I'm Lou Eisen, boxing author, historian, and columnist and podcaster, I suppose. Welcome to Ring Talk, and we're going to discuss today the final chapter of the mob's influence on professional boxing, 45 to 1960. I'll talk a bit about after about 1960 and beyond, but as of it stands today, most of boxing, the real criminals are in the sanctioning bodies. WBO, WBA, IBF, and WBC. There is still mob involvement today in certain ways, in that big name fighters have legitimate managers and a crew around them, but they also have advisors, and a lot of those advisors have criminal records associated with the mob, and this is all coming from Bob Arum. And as Arum said, you got to pay them an extra $250, $300 per fight, and that's just the way it works. And if you don't like it, you don't get that fighter. So you can see fighters that have criminal backgrounds that have boxed even in the past couple of weeks. So it's quite prevalent. But the thing is, it's been in the sport for 300 years, so it's not something that you can remove overnight. I liken it to Afghanistan, where the United States had the failed mission. They got the Taliban out, and Taliban eventually came back, but they tried to put democracy the same way that Soviet Union tried to put communism into Afghanistan, and that's a country that for the last 5,000 years, has been changing governments almost nightly, and never had communism and never had democracy, and it's hubris of people to think that it could actually work. It's never been there, never will be there. So in boxing, the criminal element's always been there from almost the beginning. It didn't take a foothold until 1921. As I said several weeks ago, with the Carpentier Dempsey fight, because that was the first fight to be $1 million gate. It made it worth the mob's while to get involved. And the mob, after that, when Oni Madden got out of prison in 1923, really grabbed the sport and formed the blueprint from which Frankie Carbo just improved on it and used it, along with Blinky Palermo and hundreds of other scumbags, cretins, charlatans, and psychotic killers that went on to run and ruin the sport, because most of the fighters from then ended up broke. Also, fighters don't have a union, but a lot of you see certain fighters like Ray Leonard, who didn't end up broke because he had legal representation. He also had Angelo Dundee to look after him too, which helped, and was able to keep his money. And a lot of times these fighters, they're coming up from broke backgrounds, very impoverished. And so when you get a guy like Wilfredo Benitez, who was a champion at 17 and now is broke and living on handouts from people, he's being supported a lot by John the Iceman Scully and other people, Russ Amber, who are sending him money. This is quite common, and it's unfortunate, but boxers don't, come from a poor background. You don't know how to handle your money. You want to get everything that everyone else has, all the gadgets and cars and watches and jewelry, and rather than do what Lennox Lewis did, which is just save it all. Lennox has one car and that's it. Can't drive anymore. One simple watch and that's it. As he said, I have a family and I don't want to end up broke and have them make a comeback years later. So I save my money. I make it work for me. And he was smart about that. Now, when we look at the mob in boxing, you're looking at fixed fights, and fights are fixed in several ways. If you couldn't get the fighter to agree to go down, the fighter, basically, if the fighter refused to take a dive and go down when he was told to go down, he simply would never get another meaningful or worthwhile fight again. And he would certainly lose that fight. Even if he dropped the other guy 10 times, he would still lose the fight, because Carbo and his cronies would get to the referee and the judges and make sure it was scored the way they wanted it scored. So you would have fights, such as the Gavilan, Kid Gavilan, Johnny Saxton welterweight title fight in Philadelphia in 57. And the great writer Bud Schoberg wrote about that. And he said this is a fight that it wasn't the best fight, but Gavilan dominated Saxton from beginning to end. And, it didn't matter because the judges was going to score it for Saxton. And after in the dressing room, Gavilan was crying. And he said, I won the fight. We all know I won the fight. But there were other forces at hand, meaning the mafia. And you couldn't, and I got screwed. But none of the reporters felt sorry for him because he also benefited from the mafia. And when he fought Billy Graham the third time, Graham won the fight, but mob, because Billy Graham and his manager Irving Cohen went into business with the mob, they weren't allowed to win the title. So the reporters didn't really have much sympathy for Gavilan. But you have to remember Gavilan and Johnny Saxton, all these other fighters that worked for the mob, or that were in the clutches of the mob is a better way to put it, didn't have a choice. They came to you, they grabbed you, they told your manager off, they got rid of him, and then that's what happened. They took over, and then they took all your money. And then when you couldn't fight anymore, they got rid of you. And these guys ended up broke, indigent, mentally damaged, and that's the way the mob worked. In 58, I know we're starting in 1945, so I guess we'll start with Madison Square Garden, or 45. In 1949, Madison Square Garden, Joe Louis was the champ from 37 to 49. And so Mike Jacobs, who wasn't well, was having 20th Century Sporting Club, 20th Century Boxing Club, which he ran, controlled by his brother-in-law, Saul Strauss, while he himself, Jacobs, was in the hospital. Strauss was not a tough guy by any means, and the mob had no problem buying them out for $100,000 to relinquish their rights to promote fights at Madison Square Garden. $100,000. I mean, today it would be $100 million or $200 or $300 million. And now it's $100,000. And because of that, the 20th Century Sporting Club was disbanded, and then along came the Big Octopus, the International Boxing Club, run by James Norris, who owned the Chicago Blackhawks, their arena, owned the Detroit Olympia, owned a lot of racehorses, was very wealthy. And what they did was they paid Joe Louis about $150,000 when he retired to use his name to help promote a tournament, telling Louis that he'd get part of the money from the tournament. Louis got nothing. He didn't even get the $150,000. He got nothing from these people. These were mobsters. And because they were mobsters, they didn't, the chair keeps rolling away here. The more I get excited. Because they were mobsters, they didn't care. In fact, Ash Resnick, who was a mobster from New York, who controlled Sonny Liston and was the one who decided Liston had to go. I don't think he actually made the call. I think it was a higher up, but he was the one that said he's becoming trouble. He was Liston's, manager, looked after him. And from what I've heard is that he used Joe Louis as a debt collector in the 1960s. In Vegas, when people owed money to the mob and the different casinos and they didn't pay, Louis would show up, which would induce them to pay, which is sad because Louis should not have ended up that way. But, he had money taken from him. He spent his money much quicker. Louis was an outlier in that he was his own worst enemy. He spent it much quicker than he got it. And that cost him. Mike Jacobs told him to save it. He didn't save it because he was broke. Constantly owed so much money to the IRS, he had to make a comeback, and making a comeback means he had to deal with the mob, and because he had to deal with the mob, he wasn't going to get the money he was guaranteed to get paid, which happened to all mob fighters. Marciano was an interesting case. Marciano loved Joe Louis, but Marciano had mob help when he fought Tiger Ted Lowry. And as I mentioned the other week, I heard this from Bert Sugar and several other boxing historians that he fought Lowry in 49, 48, and Tiger Ted Lowry was an African-American fighter, and he hit Marciano in the solar plexus. His knee came up, I said this the other week, hit Lowry in the groin. Lowry went down, couldn't continue, genuinely hurt. So he was disqualified. Then it was changed to a no decision. Then it was changed to a draw. And by morning, it was changed to a victory for Marciano. And only the mob had the power to do that. But, didn't want to sully the mob didn't want to sully Marciano's reputation because he was Italian American. He was a great fighter, anyways. He didn't need the mob's help by any means, and he went out of his way to try to help fighters that were being controlled by the mob. In fact, his manager Al Weil, worked at Madison Square Garden for the mob, and he just didn't like his contract, Marciano. So in 49 or in 55, he quit because when he first started, Weil signed him to a mob contract, which was 50-50 split. And after he became champ, he said, this isn't right. So how about 75-25? No, how about 60-40 or whatever? No. And Weil wouldn't budge. So Marciano just said, that's it, I'm done. I quit. And the mob was infuriated with Weil. They beat him up because they said, you let our biggest cash cow go. And from then on after, Marciano would never take a check. It always had to be in cash because his contract was in perpetuity. Of course, if he'd gone to court, the contract would have been wiped out. It was illegal to contract Weil made him fight or made him sign, but still, he didn't know that you could do that, and he just accepted money in cash after, and Weil lost his job because of it, and because Weil had treated so many fighters like garbage on behalf of the mob that those fighters, when he was fired, didn't have anything to do with him. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. So we're in the 1940s, and at this time there were a lot of people that were in boxing that these were all mobsters, like Felix Baciccio, and he was the trainer or the manager of Jersey Joe Walcott and other fighters. And Baciccio, he also had Curtis Hatchetman Shepard, and he was associated with the New Jersey mob and Lucky Luciano and Philadelphia's mob head Angelo Bruno. And he'd killed a police officer earlier in his career. He'd gone to prison for robbery and for assault, and he presented himself as this businessman, and he genuinely liked Walcott and forwarded him the money, and he got Walcott to fight. This is very important against Lewis, the first fight, because Walcott had no chance. He wasn't known to the public then, and Walcott had retired, and he'd had enough. He wasn't getting anywhere, so he got a job on, working for the War Department on the docks, making good money. He had 5 children, so he was very reluctant to get back into boxing, but Baciccio fixed it for him, paid him money, and fixed it that he got a fight with Joe Louis, which, based on his ranking, he shouldn't have gotten a fight, or lack of ranking. But the mob could do that. Same with Nathan Brown, was a fighter controlled by Dutch Schultz, and Schultz got him a fight against Louis. Of course, Louis demolished him, and Brown didn't deserve a fight, but for the world title. But when you have Dutch Schultz behind you saying to other people, especially Louis's managers, John Roxborough, Julian Black, it was like, you're going to get, you're gangsters too. And we're going to fight your guy. And if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. And they said, okay, you get a shot at the title. Hi, Alistair. Curtis Shepard sent Archie Moore those knit hats he used to wear, or so I read. Just watching. I'm glad you love the show. Thank you. I love your comments. So a lot of these fighters had no choice but to hook up with the mob. What was Joe Louis going to do? He'd outspent his income. So back then in the 40s, you had guys like Bernie Glickman. Glickman's an interesting guy. He was a hired killer for the Chicago outfit, the mob, the most powerful mob entity, even more so than Luciano's outfit at that time in boxing. And Glickman was later associated with Ernie Terrell, but Glickman had a lot of fighters, and a lot of these fighters, Glickman would be in the corner, and you'd be wondering, why is Glickman in the corner? He's not a manager. He knows, not a trainer. He knows nothing about boxing, doesn't know how to fill a water bottle, doesn't know how to train to wrap a fighter's hands. He's a professional killer, but he's there. This is what they meant by having muscle in your corner. Chuvalo didn't have that. George Chuvalo didn't have the muscle to make the judges honest. So if you had a mob guy in your corner, and the other guy may have been a mob guy too, but the fact that you had a mob guy meant the judges would have to be on the up and up. They were going to have to, if you had 2 mob guys, they were going to have to be legit unless one side had more power. But Chuvalo didn't have that. A lot of fighters didn't have that. And these guys were terrifying people. And now there was a fight between middleweights Rocky Castellani and Ernie Durando, and Castellani was favored to win, and Durando is believed was going to go down, and and Durando, I believe, won, and Castellani, Durando flipped the script, and Tommy Boley, who was later associated with Atlantic Records. Tommy Boley was a small-time mob guy then, and he was the manager of Castellani, and he attacked the Ray Miller, the referee. He tried to stomp him, but didn't know that Ray Miller was the former number one ranked featherweight in the world. So Miller didn't hit him back, because Miller knew you can't lay hands on a mob guy. But Miller had no problem blocking his punches and staying out of his way. And then he went and, Eboli went and used the name Tommy Ryan, beat up a guy in the New York State Athletic Commission, all this in public, and he was banned for life. And at that point, I mean, he was in a bit of a spot, because the mob didn't like having attention brought to them. And now by doing this, you're bringing FBI attention, New York State Police attention, and the courts get involved. And the mob is saying to Tommy Eboli, "What are you doing? We don't want this attention, because now we can't make money. So get out of boxing. You're not involved anymore." And this kept happening over and over and over. And what led to eventual downfall, the beginning of the downfall, with Frankie Carbo. I was calling him Bernie Carbo, who was a player for the Boston Red Sox. Frankie Carbo and his henchman, his vicious crony Blinky Palermo. But there were so many hundreds of other guys, Jaime the Mink Wallman, William Plunkett, Louis Cerecci, all these different guys that they used, that Louis Dragna, Joe DeSica, as I mentioned, Palermo, other people from the Lucchese crime family. Carbo had Jaime the Champ Siegel. He had a lot of guys that he used in boxing to help him. Bugsy Siegel, Jimmy Doyle, Jimmy Doyle Plumeri, Felix Bacchiccio, Eddie Coco, who was a major mob guy, a major mob killer. So a lot of these things were, planned out in advance. In the 1940s, what happened was you had these people involved with boxing, and they were leading on fighters. Henry Armstrong was the guy in the 30s and 40s. They had no choice but to have Eddie Mead, who was associated with Oni Madden and Frankie Carbo. And Eddie Mead, the people were wondering that you would see Henry Armstrong at parties with all these white people, and they're saying, how did that happen? And it happened because of mob management. The mob the only color the mob saw was green. That's all they cared about, was money. They didn't care about fighters, black or white, although they particularly treated black fighters worse than any other fighters. So what happened is you have all these people in the 30s and 40s, Frankie Carbo and all his hordes of evil men controlling the sport, acting as upfront managers and matchmakers behind the scenes. And the whole thing's a farce, because you're not allowed to have a matchmaker. You can't have any license in boxing. Promoter, matchmaker, manager, trainer, even bucket boy, unless you have a clean record. These were all felons. And boxing, they use different names, of course, but boxing, the mob paid these New York State and other commissions to look the other way. I want this guy to manage this fighter, but he can't. He's got a record. Here's $100,000. Okay, we'll give him a new name. And it was as easy as that. So, and it helped too, because what helped also was James Norris. When he formed the International Boxing Club, he owned Madison Square Garden, and he owned, the Chicago Stadium, and he owned the Detroit Olympia, and he owned hundreds of small arenas, or had pieces of them, like the St. Nicholas Arena, and so he owned so many hundreds of pieces of arenas around the country. You could have a fight anywhere, because he was part of it, and he loved gangsters. He just looked up to gangsters. So when we look at different fights, the gangsters controlled the welter, lightweight, featherweight, every way they wanted it to go. And, there were fights that they say, well, how did they let Primo Carnera lose to Max Baer? Carnera was a mob guy, but Baer had to pay the mob a certain due and a promise that he give them a percentage if he won the fight. Otherwise, he never would have got the fight. There were fights where guys that had no mob involvement at all got the fight and won, but never got the title. The mob just wasn't going to allow that. This is what's so special about the Ali Liston fights. This is why the second Ali Liston fight was a real fight and not a fix, as people said, because the mob never would have agreed to let Ali win the title unless they had a piece of him, and they didn't have a piece of him. But also the other mitigating factor was that Ali was, the best you could get was 7-1. So in most cases, Ali was 10, 15-1. And a lot of casinos, as Jimmy Dundee pointed out to me the other week, wouldn't take bets. They simply wouldn't take bets on that fight. And so people said Liston was afraid of Ali and took a dive in the second fight because of the Nation of Islam, the fruit of Islam, the security wing of the Nation of Islam. But Liston had the mafia behind him. He had the Chicago outfit, the most powerful mob unit on earth. Why would Liston be afraid of anyone? I mean, the mob could have killed anyone they wanted, so there was no reason for Liston to be afraid of them. What beat Liston in the second fight, of course, was the fact that the fight was delayed 6 months and he was out of shape. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So the mob had a piece of everything. They had a piece of the fighters, the managers. They controlled it all, the judging, the referees they got to, and they got to the state athletic commissions. They could buy off anyone they wanted. Those they couldn't buy off, they killed. So, and it was amazing that this was allowed to happen because, during the 1940s, when Carbo was in his prime, he had, as I said, Eddie Coco, James Jimmy Doyle Plumeri, Frank Blinky Palermo, Harry Chamsingo, Felix Baciccio, Pep Barone, all these different people that were working for him. And it seems that no one had the willpower or the ability to stand in their way. So you have many of these fights, most of them that were fixed. People are surprised to hear it. Well, that couldn't have been a fixed fight. It was a fixed fight. They were both mob guys. I remember arguing with someone over Chuck Davey, and they said, Chuck Davey wasn't a mob fighter. I said he was, but not by his own choice. He didn't want to be. He was an honest guy, but he had no choice, and he won fights against much better fighters that he should have easily beaten him, but didn't beat him because the mob had fixed it that way. And that's one problem with being a mob fighter, that you actually think you're as good as the mob wants you to think you are, and you're not. These guys are going down because they're told to go down. And one thing that is that in the U.S. District Court in the 1940s, there was a judge, Sylvester Ryan, and he said that the IBC of New York was a monopoly and participated in the murder of various people, such as Harry Big Greeny Greenberg in California, who was a mob guy who was played by Elliot Gould in the movie Bugsy. And Carbo was arrested for it 2 years later. And Greenberg was a guy who was autistic. He had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old, if that. And he had squealed or he'd spoken with the government. And they wanted to take him out for that so he couldn't hurt any more of their people. But, the problem for some of the guys was he's autistic. Carbo didn't care. Carbo found him in California, got a call from Bugsy Siegel. I found him, took him out for a drive and shot him in the back of the head and left him there. And also, Carbo apparently was the guy that delivered the money to the cops at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where Abe Kid Twist Rellis, a former Murder Inc. guy who was singing to the feds, was killed. He was thrown out a 10th floor window. Became known as the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. And that killing was ordered by Meyer Lansky. And there was a great comment in the English paper, The Observer, by Bud Schulberg, and he talked about Carbo and Palermo and their involvement in boxing in the 50s. Excuse me. And and the 40s, but in particular, one fight, 1954 welterweight title fight between Kid Gavilan and Johnny Saxton. And he said Frank Carbo, the mob's unofficial commissioner for boxing, he was known as the Underworld Czar, was controlled almost all of the welterweights and middleweights. And not every fight was fixed, of course, but from time to time, Carbo and his lieutenants, like Blinky Palermo in Philadelphia, would put the fix in. And when the Kid Gavilan Johnny Saxton fight was won by Saxton on a very dubious decision in 54 in Philly, he was covering it for Sports Illustrated. And Schulberg said that boxing was a dirty business and it had to be cleaned up now. It was an open secret that the mob was in control. The press knew that one and other fights were fixed. And Gavilan was a mob-controlled fighter. And Graham had been robbed of the title when he fought Gavilan. And it was clear Graham had it stolen from him, and the mob said the decision would be bought if it was close. The judges would always shade it the way they had been told. And Saxton was managed by Blinky Palermo, and Saxton was in particularly disliked throughout boxing because he openly praised Palermo. But Saxton wasn't a bright guy. He was told to praise Palermo, but he never got more than $2 or $3 grand to fight. Even when he was told, you're fighting on TV, you'll get 80 grand. He never got that. And of course, he had a terrible life. And when he lost his title, they let him fight and used him as a punching bag after. Ended up in a mental hospital in Long Island. Eventually ended up at a mental institution in Florida after being arrested many times for break and entry. And he would steal, break and enter, in grocery stores or laundromats or dry cleaners, or convenience stores where he would steal $2 or $3. I mean, he was out of it. They used him and discarded him. That's what they did. And Saxton was managed by Palermo. Palermo was 5'1", and he just was a vicious piece of garbage. This was a man who had no problems killing anyone and enjoyed it. And he had small man syndrome. You know, guys who are that tiny want to make believe that they're really much bigger and that they're more important than their height actually allows. So Saxton lost his title to Tony DeMarco, and DeMarco had people managing him who weren't necessarily mob but had to pay off to the mob. He lost his title in 55, Saxton to DeMarco. Regained it in a 55 title rematch. And that's my mistake. So Saxton loses to DeMarco. DeMarco loses to Carmen Basilio. And then Basilio loses the title in Chicago to Saxton in a fight that was fixed. It was booed. People got up and threw chairs into the ring. Saxton had been pummeled for 15 rounds. And Basilio he didn't know what to do when he was being interviewed. He wasn't close to crying, but he said, I don't know what to say. He said, I'm going to kill him next time. I don't care about the title now. Now I'm just going to take his life. But this was a fight that the decision was, he was saying this out loud on TV. This was the decision that was bought before the fight started. He wasn't backing down from the mob. And Saxton made the mistake of saying, well, he's a sore loser. I was a better man. He doesn't have it anymore. And Basilio stared a hole through him. Basilio looked at him and was thinking to himself, that's going to cost you your very life. Next time, it's not the title you're going to lose. It's your life. And the next fight, he knocks him out, I think, in the 8th or 9th round. And Basilio had him ready to go from the 1st or 2nd round on, but he wouldn't do it. He deliberately punished him. He deliberately, would hit him, have his knees sag, hit him another shot. His knees would sag even more, be hanging on the ropes, and then he would just step back. And he'd watch, and he'd let him recover, and then he'd attack him again. He wanted to punish him, knocked him out. And in the 3rd fight, he said, I'm just going to put him away for good. I'm going to end him tonight. Knocked him out in 2 rounds. The minute the fight started, he was across the ring, and Saxton didn't have the ability or the wherewithal to stop Basilio's punches. Basilio hit him. One of the first punches of the fight was a vicious left hook to the liver, and you could see the life go out of Saxton's eyes. His knees just sagged. And then Basilio concentrated on the head, kept hitting the liver, and in 2 rounds, Saxton was done. And not just done in that fight. Professionally, he was done. He fought some more, but it had nothing left to offer. Basilio had beaten the career out of him. And although Basilio wasn't a mob fighter, his managers, Joe Nitro and John Dijon, still had to pay a percentage of their pay to Carbo to get him a shot at the welterweight title, and also at Sugar Ray Robinson for the middleweight title. People always wonder, was Robinson mobbed up? Robinson never dealt with the mob because he was such a draw. Boxing comes down to one thing: asses in the seats. So last week we had the Ryan Garcia Gervonta Davis fight, and I asked a friend of mine, Rick Blazer, online, how much did they make? And he said they made probably 8 to 10 million each. And someone said, why that much? And he said, asses in the seats. They filled the stadium. They had 800,000 pay-per-views, and they're draws. And when you get to put asses in the seats, you make demands. This is why fighters, will complain, well, I'm not getting pay-per-view fights, and I should. Right, but you're a great fighter, but you're boring, and people aren't watching you. So, that's what happens. If you're not a pay-per-view draw, if you don't put asses in the seats, you don't get the money. Where the mob came in this is when they had, they called it theater event television and closed circuit in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where the mob would take 80% of that, plus 80% of the rebroadcast rights on TV, plus 80% of each fighter's money and the manager's money and everything involved. So they were getting wealthy while the fighters weren't. So you'd think, this guy was guaranteed $400,000 for the fight. He's walking away with 35, 40 grand. Well, people say, well, taxes, training camp expenses. It was basically mob taxes that were taking most of it, if not all of it. So there were so many fights back then that were named where the mob was and I have a list here of these fights. So Saxton-Gavilan fight was a controversial fight. However, it was very unusual. It was written into the contract. There absolutely no rematch under any circumstances. And that was written in because, excuse me, they knew Saxton was going to win. And they didn't want give Gavilan another chance. Gavilan won the fight, but that wasn't his best fight ever. And Gavilan was on the downside of his career. So Saxton-Basilio won, where Saxton, as I said, won in Chicago. That was a fixed fight in favor of Saxton. And Rocky Castellano, Ernie Durando fight was supposed to be a fixed fight, but Durando didn't follow the script. And there were a lot of fights. Virgil Akins versus Isaac Logart for the world, the world welter title. That was a fixed fight. Akins was a mob fighter, so was Logart. He had no choice. Akins got victories over guys that he shouldn't have got victories over. One fight, which I watched this past week, was Akins versus Vince Martinez. You probably may not have heard of Vince Martinez. He was one of the greatest welterweights of all time. He had something like 4 losses out of 80 or 90 fights. He was a magnificent stick-and-move fighter. He'd only been knocked down once or twice in 70 fights. And he had Akins knock him down 9 times in 4 rounds. And when you watch the fight, Martinez isn't making an effort to defend himself. He's walking in hands down, and he's getting hit with shots that he would never get hit with usually. And so Akins' fight stopped after 4 rounds, and Akins wins the world welterweight title. And that was a mob setup. Martinez was told, you're going down, and, you got to let him. I mean, Martinez was dragged to his corner after the fight, but he didn't put up a fight. He just stood there and took a beating. It wasn't, if you watch all his other fights, it wasn't the real Vince Martinez taking that beating, from Akins. It was someone else. He just wasn't making an effort. Problem was, these boxers weren't good actors. You had a featherweight fight from that time, Ike Chestnut versus Harold Gomes, and Frank Travis and Sammy Richmond managed Chestnut, and Chestnut was a featherweight, but he was a mob fighter, and the managers really were there on behalf of Frankie Carbo. Same as the Canadian Yvon Durrell, the fisherman from Baie-Comeau, who almost became light heavyweight world champion, and he fought Clarence Hinnant. And Billy Edwards was the manager of record of Clarence Hinnant, and Billy Edwards was a mobster working for Carbo. Carbo was the real manager. And so, in that respect, Durrell goes into the fight knowing that he has to do what he's told. And if he doesn't do what he's told, he's going to get hurt. This happened later on. Durrell was a wonderful fighter and a wonderful person, and he was well loved within the sport. He gave Archie Moore the best fights of his career, but him and Moore became very close friends. And Moore did a lot to help him out after he retired from boxing and had problems financially, but also the mob kept threatening him. And Moore used his influence with Doc Kearns, who was connected with the mob and knew how to use them and manage Moore to get people and other people to get the mob to leave Durrell alone. Another fight was Jimmy Peters was a mob fighter. He fought a guy named George Chimenti. These are all happening at the same time. These are all February 21st or March 21st in the late 50s, 58. And Carbo managed Peters, but he used Jaime the Mink Wallman. And Jaime the Mink Wallman was a Jewish furrier, mink coats and that's what they called him, the mink, was also a mobster that killed people, and he was an undercover manager without a license, for which he got indicted for. And he was the point man. Also, heavyweight fighter Nino Valdez and fought Alex Mitteff at the Garden on February 21st, 1958. And Carbo controlled Mitteff, but he used Jaime to make Wallman as a front man. Now, this is an interesting fight because Mitteff died later, not from this fight, but in the 60s. He been knocked out by Ali. He was one of 3 fighters to die in a short time span. We had Benny Kid Paret, who was also a mobbed up fighter, not by his choice, but his real manager, Yamil Shad, was pushed out. And Manuel Ferro, who was his other manager, who's had mob connections in New York to help Paret get the fights he needed. Paret was a great fighter, and I think would have got there anyways, because the mob didn't care about him. He took too many beatings in too short a time span, especially against Gene Fulmer, and then fought Emil Griffith the third time, only 3 months later, and died after that fight. But the mob didn't care. In fact, the mob was so vicious, I think he got 45, 50 grand for the third Griffith fight. And the money was in his locker. But right after the fight, during the fight, the locker had been cleaned out. I was told by someone it was Frank Costello who did it. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't verify that in any way. But the mob had taken his money, and, he died broke. And he made all this money during fights. And that was just how a lot of mob fighters ended up. And Carbo controlled Mitteff, as I said, but used other people. And it's interesting, another Canadian fighter, Burke Emery, fought a guy named Don McAteer. Burke Emery, for people, if you don't know him, you should. Burke Emery. Burke Emery was a great fighter. He was trained by the great Charlie Goldman, who took Marty Servo to the World Welterweight Championship. He helped train terrible Terry McGovern for the featherweight and bantamweight title, and trained Rocky Marciano for the world heavyweight title. And he helped Burke Emery after his career become a trainer. And Emery trained my favorite fighter, my dear friend, whom I love and adore, the magnificent Art Hafey, who was the #1 featherweight in the world for many years in the 70s, from Stellarton, Nova Scotia, who was rated above the world champion by Ring Magazine, although he never got a title shot. So Burke Emery fought Don McAteer, and McAteer was managed by mobster William Plunkett, but Plunkett was controlled by Frankie Carbo. So in those fights, people said, well, what if you knocked the guy out? If you knocked the guy out, it wasn't a good thing for you if you knocked out a mob fighter. You weren't allowed to do that. You were specifically told not to do that. Walcott in the 40s was interesting, Jersey Joe, because with the help of Felix Bocchiccio and Bocciccio's connections of Lucky Luciano and Angelo Bruno, he started to get the fights that he deserved. that were commensurate with his talent level. He had enough time to train. Bocciaccio said, I'm going to give you money to help you train and to feed your family. So he didn't have to work 2-3 jobs and train. And he got him to fights. People were reluctant to fight him because he was a real cutie. But because of his mob influence, because he was a mobster, Bocciaccio got those top-notch fighters to get in the ring with Walcott. He was able to force them to, and Walcott won. And when it came to close fights, where before Walcott had been screwed, it didn't happen this time because he had a powerful member of the New Jersey mob, Felix Bocciaccio, as his manager. So then we're going to go against the mob. Alistair, hey Lou, was Maxie Rosenblum mob affiliated? Yes, he was. Maxie Rosenblum was affiliated with Oni the Killer Madden. They were very close friends. And he had that great restaurant. You should Alistair, look up online and see if you can get a color picture of Slapsy Maxie's in Los Angeles. It's just a gorgeous looking restaurant. But yes, he was mob affiliated. He had no choice. There are a lot of photos. I have photos of him with Oni Madden and on a beach in Atlantic City. In fact, I might have it right here. I'll see if I can find it, but it may not be the right book. But yes, he was. And I don't have the book with me at the moment. It's about, hang on one sec. Is this it? No, this isn't. This is the book. Okay. So sorry about that, folks. So Alistair, I have a photo here in this book somewhere. And as you can see, I think it's this book. It's about Arkansas Godfather, Oni Madden. Oni Madden was, when I asked old mob guys who was the most vicious of all these guys, they always say Oni Madden. Now, this is an interesting picture. The picture on the boat. Okay, not getting it. Now, if I can, I can only get it so close to the camera. I don't know what I'm doing here. But as you can see, this man here is Henry Armstrong. And the man in the cap is Oni Madden. So Armstrong was helped by him, Oni Madden. And then there's also in this book, Oni Madden was with Mae West. And I believe, yeah. Now you ask about Slapsy Maxie, Alistair, right? So here's Oni Madden with George Raft. Madden's in the middle, Slapsy Maxie, and Kid Francis, another fighter. This is Atlantic Beach, right? So that's Slapsy Maxie. That's Oni Madden. That's the actor George Raft. That's Kid Francis. And that's taken, as you can see, in Atlantic Beach, Atlantic City in the 30s, 20s or 30s. Gamblers, mobsters love hanging out with boxers because it conferred a special coolness to them, special street cred. And you see this all the time. You know, there's that clip online that you can, and I'm sure, Alistair, you've seen it, millions of others, of 76 Oscars. And there's Sylvester Stallone talking, and who walks up behind him? Muhammad Ali. And the audience goes nuts, and he turns around. Yeah, all these movie stars, all these great movie stars through the years, and they're nothing compared to Muhammad Ali, right? Because the boxers, the athletes, are the highest you can get on the scale. And Ali was the most famous of all athletes ever to have lived. Yeah, Arkansas Godfather, it's by Graham Nown, N-O-W-N. You can get it online. He just died not too many months ago. I tried to contact him. Oni Madden was the interesting guy. George Travallo knew him too. And Madden was the guy who I said in the last broadcast ceded part of his boxing empire. He had no choice because they were moving in on it, and he had to leave New York because he's getting hassled by the police, to Carbo and Palermo, to the Lucchese family, because they had a meeting of the commission, and the commission just said, listen, Oni, we've been good to you. We're your allies. We have nothing against you, but we shared bootlegging amongst all of us. We shared the linen industry, the dry cleaning industry. We shared the jukeboxes and other things like that, because they love cash industry. You can't trace cash. and you haven't shared boxing. So you got to share. If you're going to use our muscle to help you control the sport, at least you come on. Let's have a piece of this. And Madden knew he had no choice. He had to do that. And so Madden let them have a piece of it. And this is what happened. So another fight, as I mentioned, I was just talking about these fights, were middleweights Jimmy Peters, Rudy Sawyer. Jaime the Mink Wallman was Peters' manager of record, but it was really Carbo. And of course, the fight that brought them down, the fight that ended it for the mob, was Virgil Akins versus Don Jordan. Now, what happens was Virgil Akins was the champ, welterweight champ. He's fighting Don Jordan. Jordan was a good fighter. Akins wasn't a great fighter. And they kept threatening Don Jordan that he would only get a title shot if he agreed to lose. And even though he was in Florida at the time working there, they asked Chris Dundee, the promoter, Angela's brother, how they should handle the situation. And he said, listen, and he was right. He said, Don Jordan is not mentally all there. He's very flighty. He's very emotional. So even if he wins, it doesn't matter because he's not going to be able to hold up for very long. And either Akins or another one of your fighters can beat him. So don't worry about it. You're expending all this energy on all these threats and taking a risk that's not necessary for you to take. If you let boxing take its natural course, something surprising will always happen. And so before the fight, Jack Leonard, the promoter, gets beaten up. He's beaten up with a pipe. He's in the hospital. And it's all recorded and sent to the FBI. Because he'd gone, as I said last week, to the Los Angeles police with tapes saying, this is Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo threatening me. Well, I would do what they say. That's what the police said because they're on the mob's payroll at LAPD. So what he did was, he contacted the FBI. He'd been after them for years, taped them, and Don Nesseth said, no, I'm not giving you a piece of Don Jordan. Absolutely not. And they kept threatening him, and they kept telling the promoter, tell your manager there that he better do this. And so they beat up Jack Leonard after hassling him for months. The mob wasn't used to dealing with that. They weren't used to dealing with these people that were recalcitrant, people that just didn't give in to what they said. And so he beats them up. Carbo hasn't beaten him up. Carbo's on tape. And lo and behold, Don Jordan beats Virgil Akins, but they have a rematch. And he beats him again. But they said to the mob, don't worry, another one of your fighters will come along and beat Jordan, which is what happened with Benny Kid Paret. He came along and beat Jordan because, as Chris Dundee said, Jordan is not mentally stable, and he wasn't. So, and he's not disciplined, so he's not going to hold on to the title for very long. You own every welterweight in the world except him, so don't worry about it. The only other one they didn't own was Louis Rodriguez, who was trained and managed by Angelo Dundee. So they go to court, and Carbo goes to prison, for this. He's sentenced to like 25 years, and Palermo's sentenced to 17 years. They let Carbo out early for health reasons, which was ridiculous, and he died in Florida in 1976. Palermo came out. When Palermo came out in the early days when he came out, 79, 80, he walked into a Philadelphia gym. He was hired by Don King. Don King was put in place by helped put in place by the Cleveland mob, who made a deal with New York mobs. And they said, let's have an African-American run it. Let's see how they deal with that. And King had killed 2 people already, so he's running it now. And he hired Blinky Palermo, who walked into a gym in Philadelphia, so the African-American gym, and saw people working out, and they looked pretty good. And he said, hey, you now work for Don King, and you work for Don King, and you work for Don King. And if you know what's good for you, shut up and do what I tell you. He was 90 at the time. And one of them said, excuse me, sir. He said, what? You got a problem with that? No. I just wanted to tell you, we're not fighters. We're all professionals. And I mentioned this months ago on the podcast here. We're not boxers. I'm a lawyer. That's a statistician. That guy over there is a dentist. The other guy's an archaeologist. That one's an architect. None of us are professional boxers. We're just working out because we're getting older. So you guys don't want to fight professionally? We've never had an amateur fight. We're not interested in fighting. We're just interested in exercising. So people, a lot of them essentially ignored Palermo, although King had other people on his payroll to hurt them. And what originally happened and how it got strengthened, how Carbo and these guys got strengthened, is they went into bed with James Norris and his partner Wirtz went into bed with them, along with the well-known lawyer Truman Gibson, who'd worked for the federal government and was working for Joe Louis. And so what happened was that IBC was at its downfall, was bought by the Gardens and operated as a wholly owned subsidiary. And the court decided that the IBC was a monopoly and it had to be dissolved. And so Wirtz and Norris were given 5 years to divest themselves of their holdings, which was 40% in the corporation or in the Garden. And then Ryan also declared that Judge Ryan, Sylvester Ryan, the IBC of Illinois, a monopoly, and ordered its dissolution as well. And they were appealed but confirmed on January 12, 1959. So that era of boxing was over on that day. Norris and Wirtz also announced they were selling their interest on January 30th, 1959 in the Garden to Graham Page Corporation, the New York investment company, and that became official February 19th, 1959. In 1960, the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver, held hearings into organized crime and professional boxing, and it's revealed that the IBC had ties to mafioso Frankie Carbo. Carbo ran that organization bottom to top. He was a soldier in New York's Lucchese crime family, had been a gunman with Murder Inc., had killed many people. And at the time of the hearing, he wasn't able to appear because he was in Rikers Island, having been convicted of undercover management of prize fighters and unlicensed matchmaking, which is how he operated. The question here is, how did he get these licenses? How was he able to do this when it was known if you had a felony on your record, you weren't supposed to be licensed? That was part of the deal made in 1920 when boxing was legalized in New York. But all these mobsters had paid them off. And then he was also charged in LA, which he eventually went to jail for, with after a 3-month trial, with conspiracy and extortion against National Boxing Association welterweight champ Tom Jordan. He was charged along with Blinky Palermo, Joe DeSica of the Los Angeles mob, which was run by John Vitale, and Louis Dragna of Los Angeles, who was the brother of Jack Dragna. If you watch the movie Bugsy, that's the one he said, crawl like a pig and oink to that man. In the trial, by the way, on the government, their lawyer was Robert F. Kennedy. He was the U.S. Attorney General. He didn't want to take a chance. And the defendants were all convicted and sent to federal prison. And that didn't end Carbo's controlled boxing. He controlled a lot of boxing from then on, from prison. Prison didn't stop him or any mobster from controlling boxing. And, by 1959, we get Sonny Liston was coming along. And Liston was one of the sorriest souls in the history of boxing. He'd actually started boxing in 1930s. They said he learned in prison, but Chris Dundee had posters saying Sailor Boy Sonny Liston from 37 or 35. So if Liston was born 1917, as people think, then he was 18 at the time, which would have made him, 47 when he fought Ali. I don't think he was 47 when he fought Ali. We'll never know Liston's true age, and neither did Liston. So by 1959, Carbo and Palermo owned a piece of Sonny Liston. And Liston, of course, won the title against Floyd Patterson in first fight in a minute or a couple minutes, second fight, a couple seconds longer. And of course, the Patterson before that had 3 title fights where they traded the title back and forth with Ingemar Johansson, and Tony Provenzano was the guy who provided the money for those fights. As I said, John Vitale owned about 12 to 15%, He's a mobster out of St. Louis. And it said Liston fought 12 times for Carbo and Palermo. And when Liston went to court over his various troubles, especially in late 50s, early 60s, he took the Fifth Amendment. I cannot be compelled to be a witness against myself over 25 times. They knew he'd caught him. They'd caught him. And he went to Alcatraz, the famous prison on the Rock, and then eventually was sent to McNeil Federal Island in Washington State, and then to the Ultramax in Marion in Illinois. Carbo died November 9th, 1976. And the best comment in all of this, of course, was by Arthur Daly of the New York Times, an outstanding writer. I want to read this to you before I say goodbye for today, about boxing managers and promoters. They are forever on the prowl, these mobsters, searching for the extra edge and dishonest dollar. They have no scruples, no morals, no decency. They manipulate fighters and discard them cold-bloodedly when their usefulness is over. Not until LaMotta blew the whistle did the fact emerge, for instance, that Blackjack Billy Fox is now a patient in a mental hospital, the fate that befell Johnny Saxton and many others. LaMotta was guaranteed a shot at the middleweight title if he lost, and he did lose deliberately. He took a dive against Blackjack Billy Fox, and said, later on it came out that he took a dive. He admitted it to the Kefauver Commission in 1960. Blackjack Billy Fox was not a good fighter, ended up broke, indigent, and mentally incompetent, and died a pauper. That's what the mob did for most fighters. Boxing is the slum area of sports, and the forces of evil have thus far been able to prevent any attempts at clearance or rehabilitation. Boxing is ruled by the gangster's code of silence. Evidence at a municipal or state level has been too elusive. Perhaps Congress can sweep clear the debris and order the garbage jettisoned. LaMotta's whistleblowing is a start, and strange doings of recent years in some of the lighter weight divisions may yet be laid bare. It was called the Combination. All these mobsters together were known as the Combination, and they ran boxing. I didn't know that, Alistair. Some mobster's grandkid owns a copy of Liston versus Valdez. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can get that online. I don't think so. Mobsters own most fight films. In fact, the late Steve Lott, who worked for Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs, who managed Mike Tyson and Edwin Rosario and Wilfredo Benitez, they had a company known as Big Fights Inc., and they owned hundreds. They owned all of the great big fights going back to the 1890s, all the films, because they were all owned by mobsters. And Steve Lott told me a story that they were looking for some fights from the 20s, and Bill Caton had paid $100,000 or more to this one guy, and he went out to this nice Jewish guy in Long Island who had a Jamaican maid. The guy was in his 90s. The guy's 5'2", 5'3", and he bought all these films, and he said, "Not only are we paying you this money, we're going to give you a percentage every time it's shown." And the guy said, "Thank you." And he's this little guy. I mean, very frail, and he was talking to Steve Lott and said, "You're a nice boy. Here, have some cookies. And is there anything my helper can get you?" And anyways, he gets back to the office, and Bill Caton hands him an article on this guy. The guy was one of the mob's top killers. But people said, "This little frail Jewish guy?" Yeah, because he looked like what he was. He was an accountant. He wasn't scary to anyone. No one would be afraid of him. So if he approached you to ask for directions or whatever, you wouldn't be afraid, right? He can't hurt you. But he would walk up, he'd approach you to ask for directions, and how do I get to this street? Oh, well, you go there, and then he'd take his gun out and bang. And he would do this in garages and late at night, and this is how the mob operated. As the guy said to Steve Lott, and this is where I got it originally, they made no idle threats. Boxers and managers complied, or at the very least, they were just kept out of the business. But most of the time, they were beaten up badly or killed. And with Don Jordan's promoter being put in the hospital, I mean, he was lucky he wasn't killed. They tried to kill him. But his wife came out and started to scream at them, and family dog came out, and neighbors came out and started to scream at them, and they took off. It's the only reason why the guy lived. And that was their downfall, because the Lucchese family at that point wanted to get rid of Frankie Carbo, but he went to prison, and they didn't get rid of Carbo. But they were angry at him because he was drawing all this heat. And that's the main thing with the mob. When you draw police attention, like Gotti and other guys did, when you draw all this attention, that means you have the FBI and all the police looking at you. You can't make money. And the mob exists to make money. Illegally, but to make money. And they can't do that in the glaring eyes of the spotlight of the newspapers and law enforcement. And that's why Carbo learned to operate behind the scenes, and that was his downfall when he took the phone and started to threaten Don Nesseth and Jordan's promoter. He started to threaten him because he'd had enough. He wasn't used to people saying no to him. And even though he's being told by his own lawyer, get off the phone, the FBI is listening, he did not care. And so they go to prison and they come out, and Carbo still controlled a piece of Ernie Terrell. He had Liston, and after Liston, he had Ernie Terrell, and Bernie Glickman, the killer, was in Ernie Terrell's corner. And he still had pieces of various fighters, but by the time he got out of prison, 76, or just a bit earlier, the Lucchese family just said, you're done. You're out of it. And he didn't argue. He knew that their word was law, and he retired. He wasn't healthy, but at least he got to live to 76. And the majority of boxers, 99% of all the boxers that he had intimidated, beaten up, thieved, robbed, and killed, never made it to even within 20 or 25 years of that age. And that's the true tragedy of the sport. Thank you for watching. I'm Lou Eisen. This is Ring Talk. I hope you enjoyed our series on boxing and the mob. If you have any other ideas for series or things you'd like me to look into, please don't hesitate. Go to my Substack, loueisen.substack.com, called Once Upon a Time in the Prize Ring, and you'll see more about the mob and boxing in depth, as well as many other pieces I've written on other fighters. Thanks for watching. Go Leafs, go. See you next Sunday. Bye-bye.